Welcome everybody to the WUSPBA Piping Adjudicator Development Workshop. My name is Ken Sutherland, I'm pipe major of the Prince Charles Pipe Band in San Francisco. For those of you that don't know me, I've been playing pipes for about 40 some odd years. I'm a solo competitor. I've been a part of the WUSPBA adjudication panel for the past, probably about 20 years or so, but more recently part of the new piping adjudicator development program that we put together, I guess, about 7 or 8 years ago. The purpose of this workshop is to talk about adjudicating piping, both solo and band piping, as part of the professional development for piping adjudicators, as well as having a workshop that helps solo and band competitors as well. For if they understand what a judge is looking for, it helps them prepare for competition even more. Just very briefly, the WUSPBA adjudicator program was developed and modeled after what the PPBSO Association in Ontario had put together. We worked with them to develop the WUSPBA program, as well as reaching out to some other associations in North America, so that we would have some combination of approaches for piping adjudication, and so that people from one association could judge in other associations. So there's some reciprocity. The agenda today, we'll do a brief overview of the program and then get into the actually solo piping adjudication. Some of the elements that are considered in solo playing and solo judging, including things like music theory, expression, and some practical tips for the piping judge. We'll also have a chance to do a little bit of practice too, so you can write up some score sheets on your own. After lunch, we will go into the band piping adjudication, and this will also help kind of prepare for the discussion on ensemble judging, which will happen later in the day. Here we'll also go into some of the expectations that you would have as a judge of listening to a pipe band, as well as some techniques for actually doing the judging, writing up score sheets, etc. And then we'll have some practice evaluation with bands as well. So the adjudicator development program, it's often been referred to as a certification program because there's a test and there are certain requirements to become a judge in WUSPBA. But the key word here really is development. What we've tried to emphasize is this is not a one-time certification, that there is an ongoing expectation that adjudicators continue with professional development, continue to get better, and this is one of the reasons for this workshop as well. I had mentioned that other associations have similar sorts of approaches. There are some differences, but what we have tried to do is to make sure that the categories of judges that we've developed, that we've established, the A level and the B level, are pretty much on par with what other associations are doing. The qualifications for A level and B level you can see on the website. You can check that out. They basically have to do with experience, both solo and band experience, both in terms of playing as well as leadership. There are also other elements that factor in, including teaching. So the first thing that I wanted to pass out was the WUSPBA Code of Conduct, which includes not only for judges but also for any member of WUSPBA. And in particular, there are a number of elements in the Code of Conduct that relate to competition. So there's an introductory statement in the Code of Conduct. I won't read through it. Again, you can go on the website and download this. But some of the elements I want to bring your attention to have to do with competitions and communication between judges and competitors. The overall thing that you always want to keep in mind is to avoid the perception of a conflict of interest. Of course, you want to avoid conflict of interest in itself too, but perception sometimes becomes reality. So you want to minimize the amount of communication that occurs on a competition day between the judge and competitor, and only really have enough communication to run the competition and to give some feedback about the competition itself. There's one statement here: judges and competitors shall conduct themselves so as to avoid the appearance of impropriety. So that gets at the whole perception thing. And then, of course, there are some elements here having to do with just being a good person, you know, avoiding statements that cause insult or disrespect. And that certainly holds true not only for oral communication, but also written comments on score sheets. So, unless there are any other comments about the code of conduct, let's move on. So one of the questions that comes up in about the adjudicator development program, and more specifically about the exam, is music theory. And actually, before we get into this, let me just talk a little bit about the exam itself. I think I skipped over that. So let me just go back. Yeah, the exam. The exam itself is something that does have a pass-fail score, although there are different elements to the exam that if you don't manage to pass it the first time, you can go back and retake it. So again, that's the idea that you're not taking the exam to punish somebody, but you're taking the exam as a development opportunity. The exam itself has 4 elements to it. One is on solo piping adjudication and also some elements of music theory and musical expression. The second part of the exam has to do with repertoire and your knowledge of the typical types of tunes that are submitted for competition. The third element is on pipe band adjudication. It's a little bit shorter than the solo adjudication part of the exam because there are obviously some things that overlap there. So there's a short section on things that you look for specifically in adjudicating pipe bands. And then the fourth part of the exam is actually practice writing score sheets, listening to a performance, writing them up, and in several cases actually ranking the performers that you hear. So those are the 4 parts of the exam, and I can tell you that the repertoire piece is probably the most challenging. Everybody remembers tunes differently. Sometimes you don't remember names, sometimes you do, sometimes you can write something out, but you forget the name of it. So that part of the exam recognizes that people have different ways of remembering things, and it provides several different ways of testing your knowledge of repertoire. And we'll get to that a little bit later as well.
Ken, how long does the exam typically take?
That's a good question. I think it's about, how long does it take? Do you remember?
About 6 hours.
Is it about 5 hours?
5 or 6 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to say that the first part on the solo piping and the music theory is about 2 hours long. The repertoire piece was about an hour. I think the pipe band was maybe 30 minutes, and then the write-ups were about an hour. So whatever that adds up to, that's about 5 hours or so. Yeah. Getting back to some of the questions about, so what do we need to know here? Just to kind of put aside the assumption that you need to be highly theoretical in music theory, that's not the case. I mean, basically, an adjudicator needs to know enough to be able to understand music and to be able to communicate certain aspects of musical interpretation. I mean, basic things like note values, reading and writing notes, phrases, including embellishments, including movements that are done on pipes, awareness of the major, tune categories, types of tunes, time signatures, and an ability to write out scores for these different types of time signatures. So there you do need to have an understanding of, you know, how the notes fit together for a 3/4 or for a 6/8 or for a WUSPBA or a reel. We're not looking for, again, perfection, but we're looking for that fundamental understanding of how the notes fit together into a composition. Being able to identify phrasing, and when we get into the expression part of this, of our discussion here, phrasing and motives, so the elements of music as they are kind of put together. So again, you can understand, you can listen for that, and that you can communicate it, you know, on a score sheet or when talking to, giving feedback to a competitor. The subtleties of dot cut. I mean, we have a certain constraints in the way that music is written out, you know, with the dot or, you know, an extra tail on a note. Sometimes when you're actually playing, you are giving the full value to the dot cut. Sometimes it's a little bit more subtle, and you're not playing it exactly as written. So again, you need to sort of understand those subtleties as well, and then to be able to identify mistakes in the music, either written or, you know, as it's being played, or certainly, you know, kind of a combination of the two, and be able to correct those. There are resources available that go into music theory. There's a number of you know, basic references that have been put together over the years and more recently that can be referred to develop your understanding of music theory. Campbell.
I just wanted to add on
Yeah.
that the ability to write out these 2/4, WUSPBAs and reels and 6/8 is a way for the judge to, the reason they're on the test is that we want to be able to communicate about music in real specific terms, and so we can be more helpful on our adjudication sheet if we're more have an ease with communicating in the specific time signatures, and referring to beats and bars and phrases in a more detailed way allows for a clearer message to reach the pipe bands to help them improve their performance and stuff. And so that's why it's on there. It's not just on there to filter people out in some sort of academic way.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for example, in giving feedback on a WUSPBA, you know, one type of feedback is needs more lift, that's valid feedback, but what does that mean? And if you have something in particular in mind, it's really good to give an example. So if you can quickly write out, you know, just one bar of music, and if it's, you know, if what you're trying to say is you want to cut up to the high A, da-dee-dum-ba-dum-be-dum. If you want to, if you feel that cutting up to that high A and sort of holding on to that gives the lift, then you can point to that. You know, put the F, the high A, you know, put a little arrow there, and in writing out that little bar, again, you want to make sure that when you write it out, that it all adds up. So this is you know, different ways of providing that feedback, and it all kind of comes down to just better communication among all of us of what it is that we're trying to say. So this is the part of the workshop where oftentimes we'll do a brainstorming session of you know, kind of the question is, you know, what are all the things that you look and listen for in solo piping, and usually with a group of workshop participants, we can come up with this list pretty quickly. It's not rocket science. It's something that we all think about, whether we're playing or teaching or judging. But when we start peeling back the onion a little bit, and we start looking at some of these broad areas, or even some of the very specific things like talking about pitch or timbre or balance, you know, what does that mean? again, kind of thinking about the exam and about our own development as adjudicators, having a very clear definition of what it is when we write something down on a sheet. We want to make sure that if we say pitch, then what we're talking about is the absolute frequency of that note. Whereas if we write down tone, that's a much broader sort of definition that you would want to elaborate on. So if you feel that let's say the competitor's on a very hot day and the pitch really goes up, the reed goes very, very sharp, what you want to say is the pitch went up, it's pitched too high for the day. But if we're talking about perhaps the quality of the sound on that same example, perhaps again the hot weather made the quality of the sound go very, 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 very thin. That can be the timbre, is sort of the quality of the sound. So these words have very specific connotations. Not to say that there's just one definition for each of these, but this is something that should be reviewed. You should think about what some of these words mean. And let me just throw it out to the audience a little bit. I mentioned pitch, which again is that sort of the absolute sort of sound of the note. Whatever tuner you might be using, your pitch might be, your low A might be at 478, or whatever tune you're using, whatever number, that's the pitch. And the other notes on the chanter should sound in tune relative to that pitch. Other words that are used, intonation. Campbell, do you want to take a shot at
Sure.
definition of
intonation for a solo piper would mean how, once his instrument is set up at a certain pitch, then how he maintains that pitch and control of it. So if he's blowing, if he's overblowing or underblowing, then that would be the intonation. If he's sustaining a note, a long note, then he's got to blow it, or she's got to blow it evenly and not have fluctuations. Also goes with the drone. So if you're listening to a drone that's well tuned, then you can tell it's very, very steady. And so if it's not steady, then frequently intonation is the problem, that the player is not intonating the steadiness that's desired.
Yeah, so there's that definition has an element of steadiness, or if there is a problem with intonation, then typically what's being described is that there is some type of wavering that can cause a dissonance in how things are tuned.
And for instance, when something might happen is, since maybe there's in a solo piper, there's some nervousness at the start of the competition, particularly in the lower grades, and you'll find that they may be overblowing excessively at the start, and so you notice that they're because they're so nervous that they're overblowing at the start, so the intonation is poor. And then as the performance goes on and they relax a little bit, then all of a sudden you hear the pipe come into the kind of original state it was in before they ever got near you and your pencil,
Tone is the first thing you hear, isn't it? So I tend to write it down straight away and move on, the chanter and the drones, but when they're tuning up you have to be careful, because the pipes come in, if you write it down while they're still tuning up, and then 5 minutes later they actually come in, so they are better than they were originally.
That's a very good point.
Continually monitor it, so halfway through the performance you might actually amend or add to your comments on the tone, drones and the chanter.
That's a good point. If you didn't hear that, what Lauren was talking about was that the intonation can actually change a bit, or actually the sound that you hear right at the beginning may not be quite the same as the sound at the end. In fact, if you hear a perfectly tuned bagpipe right at the beginning of a 4-minute presentation, chances are it won't be perfect at the end unless you know the person is a gold medal caliber and knows all the tricks. And that can be one of the one of the techniques that my gosh, it takes years and years to perfect that and to be comfortable with the fact when you're starting out, on a tune in a competition, your pipes may not be quite there, because the idea is you want them to come in so that they're really nice afterwards. So, yeah, kind of flip side, what you're listening for as a judge, and then the technique that you might use as a solo competitor to address that.
One of the things that I've found that's fairly common in the lower grades, grade 3, even sometimes grade 2, is you'll have somebody that's say, for example, it's a 2-4 competition, and they're playing quite well for those first 2 parts, and as everybody knows, the third part is the usual, that's where things get a little technically more complicated, and oftentimes I notice that's where sound starts to waver. It's either nervousness, person's thinking more about the music than maintaining the sound, and all of a sudden you start to get those wavering drones or something like that, and it's oftentimes a very subtle change in the sound of the pipe, and actually that's something that's extremely important for a competitor to know. It says, when you get to the third part of such and such, this is what you're doing. You might want to pay attention to that and work on that as you practice the tune. Get more comfortable with your blowing in the third and the fourth part of this music.
Yeah. Some of the other, Campbell, yeah.
One thing I wanted wondered if you would comment on is that as an adjudicator, there's different qualities of pipe that come up. We expect to have good intonation for everybody and well-tuned and a nice balance, but sometimes the pitch is higher or lower on a pipe. Sometimes the timbre of the pipe is different. So you might have, whenever you could speak to that in terms of if you're sitting there as a judge and you hear a pipe that's sort of maybe a little softer sound, a little sweeter sound, as opposed to maybe a pipe that's a little bit flatter in pitch. As a judge, how are you supposed to deal with that? Are you supposed to, if you have a personal preference, are you supposed to apply that, or are you supposed to sort of be acceptable of different sorts of setups?
I think this also comes up when you're talking about expression as well. But of course, everybody has personal preferences. And as a judge, you're not expected to totally ignore your own personal preferences, but you are expected to factor in an open mind. So let's say you prefer a bagpipe that has a dominant bass drone, big, bold kind of drone sound with a chanter that projects a lot. So it's kind of the big sound, right? If you hear several competitors that don't have that sound, you certainly don't want to write them off and just say, And then the one with the big bold sound comes up, and you say, oh, that's perfect, and you ignore everything else about their performance, like maybe they missed a part or that sort of thing. So it is very much a balance. But when it comes down to, if there are 2 competitors that in other elements they tuned their pipes well, the notes were tuned with each other. There was overall good balance. In other words, there wasn't the drones weren't dominant to the chanter. They played the tunes well. All that other stuff being equal, you still have to decide which person gets first place, and or whatever the ranking is. And so that's where personal preference is going to come in. And if you like that bolder sound, then you're going to say, well, I'm going to rank this person higher than this one. And you can, as long as you can justify it, and if you felt that everything else was, was nearly equal, and you just thought, that put that other person over the top, then yeah, it's a personal preference. But you do have to, I think as a judge, keep an open mind for that, as well as you know, expression, musical interpretation, some of these things that are very subjective. The idea is you give the players somewhat the benefit of the doubt because they have their preferences, but in the end, you need to decide who's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, etc.
So in the triad of tone and music and technique, you're saying that if the music and technique of 2 players is roughly equal, that perhaps the tone is the thing that might separate them. And if you prefer the tone of the big sound, let's say, then that might be the breaking point, and that might be the adjustment.
Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah. Converse to that, if you're judging a lower grade band, so pipers, very rarely are you going to have 2 players close. Someone's going to stand out, and the tone's not really going to be an issue. So you might end up giving first to the guy who has a big harsh pipe anyway, but you might add as a comment, pipes rather harsh for me personally.
Yep.
It's just a note to him. It's not coming to the...
That's, yeah, an excellent point. You can always put comments onto the score sheet that didn't necessarily affect how you ranked them, but it is, you know, communicating a personal preference. And the way that you communicate that, just like you said, you know, I prefer, you know, a sweeter sounding pipe, or, you know, something to that effect, rather than fix that pipe, it's just way too, you know, way too harsh. You don't want to try and, you know, act like a teacher or instructor. In that case, you're just offering an interpretation, an opinion, excuse me. Let's take one more thing on tone, and that's balance. Anybody want to take a shot at balance? What balance means to them?
Yeah, usually when I make a comment on balance, what I'm concentrating on probably more than anything else is the pipe in tune from top to bottom. You know, when somebody's playing their bottom notes, you know, the drones sound pretty good. Does it sound the same way when they're playing those high notes? Is everything pretty much in tune all the way up and down the scale?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I'm looking for on balance is there a dominant sound on the pipe such that, so for example, maybe the chanter is a very, very quiet sound and those drones are really overpowering the chanter. I might make a comment on something like that. So it's 2 things. It's the balance from the top and bottom of the scale. It's also the relative contribution of the drones versus the chanter sound.
So there's an element of pitch there in terms of balance, where all the notes are in balance. And then there's an element of volume. The drones to the chanter, back and forth. There's an element of volume in terms of the tenors and the bass. You know, sometimes if somebody has a very, very quiet bass drone, the sound becomes sort of tenor dominant. And there's also the volume of the chanter itself relative, you know, lower notes to higher notes, say. If the high A sometimes sort of disappears, that it's very, very thin. So there's an issue with balance perhaps on the top hand or the bottom hand. So again, when you're writing up a score sheet or giving feedback, you say, well, pipes were not in balance. Well, you got to go into a little bit more detail. What do you mean by that? Drones to chanter, chanter to itself. So again, it's important to you know, articulate a little bit more and maybe give an example in that case. Let's take a step back and just talking about what you're expecting, what you're listening for. Tune selection is something that you know, with the lower grades, you expect to hear perhaps simpler tunes. You wouldn't necessarily hear a grade 4 player try and tackle, you know, Bonnie Ann or Abercrombie Highlanders or something like that. And then as you go up and to the grade 1 and open category, you probably don't hear too many grade 1 or open players play you know, Australian ladies. But it's a broad range. So what are some of the elements that you look for in terms of tune selection and how that tune is performed? Lauren.
A hard one that I find is you have someone who plays a relatively simple tune and then another person plays a more complex, harder 2/4 march, for example. They're both close, so but there's various mistakes in each. But who's better? You know, someone's played a simpler tune, so it's easier to get away with what they, doing it. That's quite a dilemma I still have.
Yeah. Yeah. So the difficulty of the tune in terms of the embellishments and the just how the tune is structured kind of factors in. So do you give just a little bit more credit to somebody who is tackling a little bit tougher tune, but they have to at least play it well enough so that so it does justice to that tune? I don't think that there's any particular rule here that has to be followed, but you do have to kind of consider, the difficulty of the tune, as well as if somebody's playing a very simple tune, the musical part of it, I think, really has to come out. You don't want to, if a competitor is playing a tune that may be a little bit too simple for them, or simpler than say some of the other tunes in the grade, I would expect them to play it musically, nearly flawless, if that could be, if that's an appropriate word. You would expect to hear them get as much music out of the tune as possible. You want to hear as much music out of any tune, but if it's simple, you don't want it to come across as simple if you're a competitor.
Usually the issue in tune selection is more common with the issue that's more common with the lower grades is not somebody that's picking a simple tune, somebody that's trying to play something that's a little bit
too tough,
a little bit beyond it.
Yeah.
I've actually had grade 3 competitors play Highland Wedding for me, for example, in a 2/4 competition, and it's not like they're not playing it terribly or something like that, but one of the comments I usually make is, over and above how they played it, says, maybe you're putting yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage, maybe you might want to consider another tune or something like that. Or if really and truly it's something that's beyond them, beyond their ability, I'll tell them that.
Yeah.
It's just this, you're not quite to the level where this tune is appropriate.
That brings up an issue of sometimes competitors will take a difficult tune and remove some embellishments so that they can play it, and that's one of the challenges. Again, there may not be a rule of thumb, but you need to have it pretty clear in your own mind how you treat that kind of situation. That's one of those situations that it's like you didn't expect that they were going to leave this Torluith out, or they were going to substitute a GDE grace note instead of doing a Torluith. And how does that affect the musicality of the tune? How do you as a judge feel about somebody changing perhaps what the composer had intended? And the thing is that with pipe tunes, I guess with all tunes really, any type of musical arrangement, there's always a bit of an interpretation, and things change over the years sometimes. A tune like the Smith, you put 10 pipers in a room, you'll get 12 different interpretations of it with different embellishments, sometimes even different parts. But in particular, if somebody's removing embellishments, maybe sometimes you could say, well, okay, that's okay. They did that in order to improve the musicality. But at what point do you say, no, you're messing with it too much?
It's a difficult one because you have to be very careful when you start commenting on the settings. A, you might be wrong,
Yeah.
Yeah.
They'll
Yeah.
produce a sheet of music that they've been given by someone, perhaps even their tutor who's written it out himself and then done it on the software.
Yeah.
But they'll still, someone will have something still, and that's the way I was taught it. But you know it's not right. It's not the way John McCall wrote it 100 years ago. But they'll still produce sheet music to say, well, that's the way I
Yeah.
was taught. So you have to be careful. But you know, if you know it's wrong, but you just can't put your finger on it. I just put setting question mark. And okay, I might not take it into account in awarding the prize, but I'll still, unless it's blatantly wrong. But if there's something iffy about it, I'll comment. But sometimes you have to be careful.
Yeah, I think more and more now you run across solo competitors that they get their music from their band, and in the band settings we put together sometimes in order for the whole band to be able to play it. Yeah, you did remove that embellishment, or you changed that around, or you changed the grace notes around, and the solo competitor is just, well, this is the music that my pipe major gave me, and so.
It's a very, very complicated issue when you start poking around in the tune selection, and also to even the business of a solo player playing band settings. And now what I'm finding is that with the internet, that the solo players are just downloading music from I don't know where,
Yeah.
and then they've got their music and they produce it in front of you. The other thing that's part of it is that as a teacher, when you're teaching, the idea that you play simple tunes and then you kind of increase the complexity as time goes on is sort of a linear interpretation of teaching, that is sort of like a straight line kind of learning, one little bit step by step, a little bit harder, a little bit harder. I'm not so sure that that's the model of learning music. And so I think if you think of it that way in a teaching sense, I'm not so sure that that's sustainable for everybody. The other thing that is something to think about is that you are adjudicating a competition. So it's not, I mean, that's what you're doing. And so you've got to weigh how you're going to balance these different components and reward the ranking, as opposed to developing the musician, which is that's a different issue.
Right.
And so it's, so you can get deeply into thinking about it, and it's very, very confusing, at least for me, of what I really value. I don't know if I've thought that all the way through.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's a tough one.
Yeah, Lauren.
Charlie and I judged a band a few weeks ago, and it was slightly, going off the topic slightly, but they simplified the first tune down so much that it was almost unrecognizable. And this is weird.
Yeah.
It's a grade 4 band, so I'm all for keeping it simple, but the tune was almost unrecognizable. Those grace notes missing, or just shoot.
Yeah, if it compromises the, sort of the generally accepted musicality of the tune, then it probably has crossed the threshold.
I mean,
Yeah.
they actually still won, but I did comment about it. Careful to simplify it.
I think getting back, Campbell, to your point that there is a big overlap in the skills as a teacher, the skills you have as a teacher, and the skills you have as a judge. When you're actually, I was thinking about a comment from John Madden, the football coach, that his approach was when you're teaching essentially during practice, during football practice, but when you're on the sideline during a game, you're coaching, and it's a little bit different. The two skills. You shouldn't try and teach somebody when you're in the middle of a game, and when you just need to be acting as a coach there. Slightly different in what we're talking about, but on the other hand, when you're judging, you shouldn't think in terms of I need to teach this person something. You're expressing an opinion. You're basically justifying how you have ranked the competitors. And there are opportunities where you may feel, well, gosh, it would be good if this person knew, sort of what they were doing, if they were playing something wrong, and so you communicate that. But you do have to be careful in terms of you're not there to provide long-term development for the competitor.
Is it in our rules that we're not supposed to comment on the setting of tunes anyway? How does that work? Yeah.
I'm not sure. I know in the RSPBA for bands you can't comment on tunes or arrangements, but I don't know that that has trickled down into actually on our rule books. I don't
So
know.
bands.
For bands it is?
Yeah, it is.
For bands, yeah.
But for solo, it's just open?
Well, again, yeah, probably, and certainly not the general category of tune selection. We've probably gone a little bit more, you know, into some other aspects of that, but certainly not on tune selection, you know. And again, I think everything factors into your overall impression, but none of these areas should be an absolute, you know, deal breaker, unless, of course, you know, in the introduction they play 2 bars and stop. I mean, that's a deal breaker. So let's talk a little bit about music then. Some of these are you know, fairly, you know, broadly used terms. Tempo, I think that's, you know, pretty universally accepted. You may have a different interpretation of how fast the jig should be played, but you know, tempo is a pretty universally understood term. Expression is a very, very broad term, and so when you say that the tune needs more expression, you know, again, it's a valid overall comment, but in order to substantiate what it is that you're talking about, you want to give some examples which get into some of these other phrases and terms. Phrasing, rhythm, conforming to the idiom being sort of the natural structure and rhythm of a tune. A strathspey has a certain idiom, a jig has a certain idiom. Let me ask you know, about phrasing. We'll do a little bit of an exercise looking at phrasing in tunes. Any rules of thumb that you guys use in terms of listening for phrasing, or are there any rules of thumb? Any thoughts on that?
I think that you can think of phrasing kind of like call and response sometimes. There's sort of like one part of the music asks sort of a question, and then another part of the music forms an answer that comes back to it. So that could be in a 2-bar phrase followed by a different 2-bar phrase, or it could be shorter bits of phrases. It could be like in a strathspey, maybe a 1-bar 4-beat followed by a 2nd-bar 4-beat. So from tune to tune, there's a little bit of variety. And so I think that some of the tunes, certainly for the test, I think that what we're preparing for is that you probably want to be familiar with some regular tunes that everybody knows, and pay attention to where these phrases start and stop.
Yeah, and we'll do a little bit of an exercise on that as well. Rhythm. Thoughts about rhythm? For me, rhythm is, you know, if you think about, you know, the beat of a tune, oftentimes the rhythm comes in kind of as what makes up each of those individual beats, or sometimes 2 beats, you know, in a bar, say. So it's kind of the in between, you know, pulsing that you get. Different tunes, you know, tunes that are 6/8 or 9/8 have a compound rhythm with generally 3 beats, you know, or 3 pulses to a beat. Other types of tunes have 2 or 4, but even within that, there can be sort of a dot cut kind of rhythm within each beat. So this also gets to, as a judge, the ability to communicate the comments about rhythm, sometimes by writing out a little bar of music and pointing to, you know, what are the notes that help to establish that rhythm within each of the beats. Let's move on into, and some of this stuff will come up as we talk more about, you know, actually listening and writing up a score sheet.
Before you move
Oh,
on,
yeah, Bob.
one comment I'd make on phrasing that I typically do, and again, it's with oftentimes with the lower grade pipers. What I notice is that when somebody's playing something that lacks phrasing, the tune usually has a little bit of a round expression to it. It kind of runs together. And when a tune lacks phrasing like that, everything else kind of breaks down. So phrasing to me is always that's the critical, like Campbell says, that question-answer breakdown of the tune. And what I often tell competitors is, look, you gotta be able to ask the question before you get the answer.
Right.
So it's a very subtle thing, but once you start breaking a tune down into phrasing and you've got it phrased correctly, usually all of the other stuff will follow with it. If you're phrasing it correctly, you have to play it at a tempo such that it enables you to phrase it. Your expression has to follow from that, you know, if you're phrasing correctly. So phrasing to me is probably one of the, it really and truly is the building block that underlies all of that other stuff. If you lack phrasing, everything else kind of breaks down. If you've got the phrasing right, then you can put together all of these other things and improve on them. But to me, the musical expression, the tempo, the rhythm, you know, the pulsing that you get, it all comes from that proper phrasing. So that to me is really a critical piece of the music. And in particular, if I find somebody who lacks that phrasing, you know, I'll really point that out and write out an example of, you know, just a very simple tune. Sometimes I even use Scotland the Brave. I'll do those, write out a real quick two-bar thing. Says, this is what I mean by this.
Right.
And, you know, because that's a tune that just about every one of the lower grade players obviously is very familiar with. And oftentimes when I talk with these competitors afterwards, that's usually something that comes across that they can understand. And like I say, it's such a fundamental thing. Everything else sort of flows from it.
Like a building block, yeah. Lauren?
Also, you have to assume that they don't understand what the phrases that you use. I've been guilty of this. Just saying question and answer, or it's too square. You need to point it more in a way and not understand what these piping phrases mean. But as you're talking about expression, you have to expand on it slightly so then it's actually understand what you're talking about. I've been guilty of that, you know. It's very square, but then you're like, he's not going to know what that means.
Yeah. Is square the same as round? You know, sometimes those two are used interchangeably. Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent points. I always think of phrasing as when we speak, we don't. Hopefully, we don't use run-on sentences. I don't say, my name is Ken Sutherland, I'm a piper who lives in Menlo Park, California. I have 2 children and a wife that I've been married to for 30 years. You know, you say, my name is Ken Sutherland. I'm a piper. I live in Menlo Park, California. And I have 2 children and I have a lovely wife I've been married to for 30 years. And so it leads to more understanding on the part of the audience of, you know, what I'm trying to get across. Whereas if it's just all run on, it just becomes blah 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 blah. You know, and that to me that's what I try to use when I'm teaching. You know, to use those sorts of examples of phrasing. Getting into technique, you know, we often think about, well, you know, this person has a good set of mitts and they can, you know, they can do Tor Lewis and Burls and it all sounds good. Is playing embellishments the only thing to technique? Are there other aspects of technique that factor in there? Lauren?
False fingering to watch for.
False fingering to watch for. Sometimes you can't hear it. Sometimes you can, but other times you can't hear it, but you can see it. Yeah, oftentimes like if you have a few high A's in a row, the end of Susan McLeod. You know, when you're doing those C's and B's, sometimes you know, somebody's going up to a high A and you see the notes open there. You may not really hear it because it's coming so quickly, but you can see it. Yeah, so false fingering that that may not be picked up in the sound, but you can see. How about the way that movements are placed in a tune? Let's say a torlueth, pretty big movement. It takes up some time. It doesn't take up any time on our written music, but it really does take up time. Your thoughts about how movements are placed and how they actually help create rhythm. So like well, actually, we have an example in the Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band, that first torlueth. So we'll get to that in just a second. Staying true to the intent of the composition, that's where we touched upon a little bit about you know, taking things out, or sometimes putting things in. I sometimes hear G grace note being put on burls when that really wasn't in at least the printed music that I had seen. Sometimes a G grace note on a burl adds an additional bit of rhythm that may not be, you know, intended in the composition, like at the end of a part in a march. Versus, you know, that extra G grace note, it's kind of like, oh, that's a little bit too much. Whereas the burl, just plain burl by itself, is, I think, a little bit more true to the rhythm. So it works both ways a bit. Is it a deal breaker? Probably not, but it may be something that you comment on.
Yeah, it is interesting to think. I know that I've been playing for a while, and just the placement of the movements, how you play the movement is one thing, but then where you place them, so that sometimes when you have if a movement starts with a G grace note, it typically starts on the beat, right on the beat. And other movements like grips perhaps don't start on the beat, they end on the beat, kind of a thing. But it's interesting that the burl, when I was first learning the burl was like a grip. It ended on the beat. And now the burl is more like a doubling. It begins on the beat, so at the end of the thing, you can start to do the burl, so it's more like a doubling and less like a grip. And so it's interesting, this kind of thing, when you're thinking about it, as an adjudicator, you have to kind of think through some of this stuff, and it actually adds to your refinement of what's going on. And you hear somebody like Alistair Gillis playing his doublings and his marches and kind of thing. It might be a little bit different than, say, Jack Lee playing his doublings and such and his marches, those kinds of things. And can you appreciate both of them as an adjudicator? You know, which direction are you sort of leaning to? I guess that would all come into technique.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a crossover between the music, you know, because it has to do with rhythm, and then the technique. So the technique itself helps to create the musical interpretation. So a burl, whether you place it a little bit before or a little bit after, or right on the beat, that helps to establish the musical interpretation.
Yeah, one of the things that you sometimes come across is somebody who's got, you know, beautiful doublings and that sort of thing, but when, I don't know why this is, but when they play torluas, play them very open. And it really breaks the rhythm of the tune because they're playing in too open. You know, it's almost like you're dragging the thing out an extra half a beat. And I've oftentimes made comments that, you know, you just have to tighten that up because, you know, you are breaking the rhythm. Breaking the rhythm of the tune, yeah. By doing that.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a very, very important thing for people to know. And obviously, in a competition, sometimes I've actually been in a position where sometimes that's been a make or break thing between two people that are actually fairly close in just about everything else, simply because the articulation is so open that it's affected the way the tune is played.
Lauren?
And I think to watch for, I don't know if this is what you do with this, we've all done it. A guy who misses a doubling in the first part and knows he's done it, so does it all the way through the tune. I've seen that, I've done it.
Yeah.
You know he's done it, but what do you do?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a trick.
It's consistent.
Yeah. It's dangerous as a competitor, because then you can get marked down for, you missed 4 E doublings instead of just the one, And you got to remember, let's see, now did I do it? But yeah, I've seen some very creative approaches to that. Even a note mistake, it's like, repeat the note mistake.
Then you're scrambling to change a setting and bring it back to that.
Yeah. So, okay. So kind of bringing it back to the exam, there are some of these words that are on the exam that you're asked to give your interpretation of the of what that means, and it's a way again to get you thinking about about some of these terms that you're using on score sheets, just to make sure that you are that you're clear about that. Some of the other elements of the competition, kind of start to finish. The introduction with a solo competitor, you don't have the attack like you do with a band, but there is an element of introducing the tune. Some do it very dramatically, and they're up there and they're on the E, and then maybe a little bit too much drama, but then you see others that they're up there and they blow up and and they just kind of get right into the tune. For the solo competitor that's thinking about this, you want to get the point across that you're ready to go, and then here's the introduction. And the introduction is not just the first note of the tune, it's really the whole first part. You want to establish what it is that you're doing. So as a judge, that's what you want to listen for, is the competitor, introducing the tune, and are they kind of, getting the point across, I guess, of what they're trying to do. You do want to hear you want to listen for, are they blowing their pipes, right up to the end, maintaining the tempo? Is there a clear sort of break, if you will, change from one time signature to the next, and are they introducing the next tune in such a fashion that it's clear that they know what they're doing and they're trying to get a certain point across? So that whole break, and this is the case in listening for pipe band competitions. So you want to be especially attuned to sort of the last part of the one tune. Listen for all of these things. Is the blowing still there? Is the tempo? Is the technique still there? And then listen for that introduction into the next tune. So when you talk about great break, or bad break to the Strasberg, what was it? Was it that they stumbled at the last part of the march, or was it that they went into the Strasberg and hesitated a bit going into it? You want to give a little bit of feedback on that, what you mean by bad break, or oftentimes, well, if you say good break, you probably don't need to. The finish of the tune, much like leading up to a break. Again, you want to listen for that the tone, maintaining the tempo, maintaining the idiom, and at the end. Now, in a solo competition, typically they won't. The solo competitor doesn't just stop the drones right at the end. it's probably a little bit better to actually, you know, still maintain the pressure, go down to a low A, you know, do a little finger gymnastics if you like, so that there's no doubt that you're blowing all the way to the end. But with a finish in a solo contest, you know, what are there things that you listen for, or that you may mark somebody down for, you know, at the end of a performance? Any thoughts on that?
Maybe just, maybe there's a rush to the finish
Mhm.
sometimes, you know, a hurry, especially in reel playing.
Yeah.
You know, a hurry to the finish. Also, I find myself wondering on the breaks and the finish, it's like the relationship between the solo and the band styles, as it were, so that I know that in a break, for instance, you shouldn't be finishing one tune prematurely. You want to give full value to the last beat of whatever the first tune is, and then commence the next tune. But sometimes you can have a straight break to it right on the beat, or sometimes you have this extra beat of transition, you know. And then same thing on the finish. If you cut it off cleanly and it's a clean cut with a good sound, versus you play through the ending and then kind of finish. There's different ways to do it, I suppose. You know, I tend to go into what you're saying about it in terms of a finish. It's like I'd rather have them play through and then wind down. But if somebody does it very cleanly and neatly,
Yeah.
is there something wrong with that, or does the adjudication really stop at the last note? You know, not sure.
I would only say there's something wrong with it if it impacts the, you know, the presentation of the tune. Like if they're doing a quick cutoff, and it's on a D tap, and the tap really doesn't come through. You know how with bands, oftentimes if you have ending on a D tap or something, the tap is almost non-existent. It's just a way to, you know, and the drummers are, you know, giving a good whack on the drum, so you can't hear it anyway. But in a solo competition, if there's a, you know, Mrs. McPherson of Inveran, and they got to hit the D tap at the end, and it's truncated, I would say, no, you know, play it all the way to the end, and then stop.
Yeah, one of the issues that comes up that affects everything out here is the tempos that these tunes are played at. Say you're in an MSR competition. Oftentimes, what I come across is people who start rushing. You know, they'll start out at a high tempo, and then things just start steamrolling from there, and eventually the instrument's got control of them instead of them having control of the instrument, and then it affects everything. It's the breaks, the transitions, the whole bit, because they're going too fast.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course it affects the whole thing, but it comes down really to an issue of tempo and control. You know, they're not playing something that they're not playing at a tempo that they're comfortable with, and therefore everything starts rushing, everything starts tumbling together. And actually it becomes such a dominant influence on the performance that if you'd only been able to control that, you would have played so much better. You know, and it's a nerves thing. I mean, we've all done it. You know, so it's really more a case of while it's going back to tempo, again, it's one of those things that affects the whole deal. You know, and then the little slips start showing up. You know, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that can affect tempo? Somebody's nerves. I mean, you know, adrenaline is an amazing thing, right? You know, they get going into a tune and it's way too fast. On the exam, again, as a way of getting you to think about some of these situations, you're asked to give your opinion on you know, why is there something happening here? You know, why is you know, somebody playing too fast? Why is the you know, why is the tempo erratic? You know, or why do you think you know, a particular embellishment is not being played correctly? So that's one of the things, you know, as you're thinking about all the various elements of this, is a little bit about why. That doesn't necessarily affect the competition. I mean, if somebody's playing fast, they're playing fast. But again, the feedback. You're not teaching, but you're giving your opinion. And you know, there is an element of helping people out. Kind of like if it's really clear that somebody is really nervous and they just start into it, you know, you might just say, you know, recognize your nerves, start out slower than you think you should. You know, there's something along those lines that can help them in the next competition.
Yeah, oftentimes when something like that happens, I'll say, you know, it's actually going to be something innocuous. I'll say something like, tempo seems brisk, and then it's nerves, question mark.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, oh, it's your nerves, says, well, you know, maybe it's your nerves. You know,
Yeah.
I want to think about that.
Yeah, right. Another one that certainly nerves can affect, but a lot of other things can affect too, is blowing, and that has an impact on everything. Particularly if somebody is, you know, has a set of pipes that's too hard for them. That's going to affect, I know for me, it affects everything. You know, whether it's just, you know, being able to articulate movements correctly. If the pipes are too hard, it affects everything. And we all know as players that, you know, something gets into your head, you know, just forget it. So if you're struggling with your bagpipes, you're not going to be able to focus on the music and on all the things that you've worked on. So blowing, again, the idea of having, you know, the intonation being nice and steady, there are elements to blowing that, you know, as you develop as a competitor, you start to recognize, you know, again, maybe on a hot day when the reeds go a little bit, you know, get a little bit easier, that you have to kind of back off on your blowing a little bit. But oftentimes when you know, in the lower grades and pipers that are starting to recognize that they, you know, blowing, you know, harder or softer really does have an impact on the sound. Sometimes you'll hear, you know, people try to do too much with the blowing. You know, blow too hard, blow too soft. You know, the bottom line is it needs to be absolutely rock steady, but little habits can creep in as well. I find that oftentimes I'll listen to a competition and just blowing on D, for some reason, for lots and lots of pipers is people will tend to slack off on the D a little bit. And I really don't know why that is, but it seems to be kind of prevalent. And that's, you know, that's a matter of, it takes a long time to kind of get out of that sort of habit, but it certainly creeps in. Any other thoughts about blowing? I mean, it's kind of, again, one of those basic things. Other issues, and these are a little bit more visuals, when even though, and it specifically says in the rules, WUSPBA rules, that competitions are judged only on musical presentation. In other words, not physical presentation. So if somebody's marching to a 2/4 march and they're not really marching on the beat, you know, do you take points off for that, or the fact that they're just marching fulfills the requirement that they march if it's grade 3 or above? Yet it kind of gets into your mind a little bit as a judge. If somebody's playing a tune and they're not marching to it, you kind of wonder a little bit about whether they really understand the you know, the beat, the idiom, the rhythm. Lauren?
You might suggest that they march if they're doing something wrong. You know, you might suggest that they march, so it'll help you keep the tempo more, or stay on the beat more, or whatever it is. You might say that.
Yeah.
See, that's another thing in our rules, isn't it, that you have to march for a 2/4?
Yeah.
So I sometimes get people who can't march, or don't march, or not ready to march, or whatever, and yet they're still in the competition. So I'm wondering, should I disqualify that person, or should I just, is it some sort of a deduction or something like that? I don't know. What? I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah, I don't think that we have a hard and fast rule on
No,
that.
I don't think we do. It just says you're supposed to march.
You're supposed to march.
Right.
If someone has a disability that obviously doesn't allow them to march, that's one thing.
That's one thing.
But that's I haven't come across that many in the. I think grade 4. I thought that grade 4 it was optional.
It is.
It is, okay. And in grade 3 and above, I'm not sure I've encountered anybody not marching. So, if I did, I would probably kind of deduct some points for that. But is it a deal breaker? I don't know. Maybe that's something the music board should rule on.
I don't remember seeing.
We'll take that under advisement.
Okay, good. Okay, and then the last thing is this is more again for competitors. We're all human. We all react to visual cues. A competitor coming up who is sort of dressed nicely and approaches the bench and makes eye contact and as opposed to someone who's not really maybe their kilt hasn't been ironed in ever and kind of says, I'm going to play you react to that a little bit, and it's again, it's not so much that you end up marking them down, but you have to recognize as a judge that you do react to visual cues as well. And then on the flip side, as a competitor, it always helps to kind of come up and engage with the judge and present your tunes written on a little card, rather because some of us are beginning to lose our hearing just a little bit, except when there's a nice loud bagpipe playing in front of you. So that's kind of one of those techniques that a competitor should use to sort of present themselves to the judge. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand out this this package here has some of the stuff that we just went over, as well as a few other handouts having to do with judging solo piping. So we've talked quite a bit about musical expression, and this is a chance right now we can get into some examples of some of these concepts of phrasing, introducing some levels of sophistication or subtleties in terms of how we're interpreting the music within each of the phrases, and then some of the other elements of rhythm as it affects expression. For instance, the use of the offbeat, or the importance of the offbeat, particularly in a tune like a reel. And we'll continue and as we go through this, talk a little bit more just generally about musicality. In the exam, in the first part of the exam, there is a section where you are asked to look at a piece of music and offer your opinion. First, as far as where are the musical phrases, and then also to offer your opinion as to how to get the maximum amount of musicality out of the tune. So why don't we? I think I have this right. Why don't we take a few tunes here now? In the package, I think we have some different tunes. I think we have the Balmoral Highlanders and a few others. But This particular one, Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band, as far as the overall phrasing, I think you can never go wrong if you think in terms of 2 bars. Now there may be other subtleties to that. There may be some sub-phrases within the 2-bar phrases. But in this case, let's look at the music here. If you think in terms of 2 bars, obviously you have an introductory note here with an E. On the exam, you're asked to identify the introductory notes or the transition notes with a little arc underneath the note, and the main phrases with an arc over the notes that constitute the phrase. So in this case, what you're talking about here is the phrasing being 2 bars. Now the question is, and this is where it gets into a little bit of interpretation, is the phrase hum ba-dum bum ba-da dee dee dum ba-da, da, da, and then does it end on that high G, or does it end on the E or the D? Hum ba-dum bum ba-da dee dee dum ba-da dum ba. Well, that doesn't sound right. You know, that sounds like we've gone a little bit too far. How about if we end on the E here? Hum ba-dum bum ba-da dee dee dum ba-dum bum ba-da-dee. To me, that doesn't sound quite right either. To my ear, the phrase really ends on this high G 8th note. Hum ba-dum bum ba-da dee dee dum ba-dum, da 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 dee da da dum ba-dum ba-da dee da dee da da, da dum ba-dum bum ba-da dee dee da da dee, dee da dum be dum ba da 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 dee dee dum ba-dum. So that is the way that I would think about the phrasing of this tune. So to mark it up, which I better not do on the screen,